They told you ghosts aren't real, but have you ever wondered why the shadows move when no one is there?
It was 2:47 a.m. when I first noticed the shadow wasn't mine. I was sitting in my dimly lit living room in Spokane, Washington, a mug of coffee growing cold in my hands. The soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen was the only sound, accompanied by the faint creak of the wooden floorboards beneath me. I was alone, completely alone. Or so I thought. That's when I saw it. The shadow cast on the far wall didn't mimic the way I shifted in my seat. My hand went up to adjust my glasses, but the shadow's hand stayed still, resting on its knees. My breath caught in my throat. I stared, unblinking, willing it to move. Slowly, impossibly, it turned its head, not toward me, but away, as if scanning the room for something. The ordinary world. I wasn't supposed to be up that late. My life was painfully ordinary, which I suppose is why the insomnia crept in over the years. Work, sleep, repeat, that was my routine. I managed an antique shop downtown, a place filled with dusty shelves and stories no one cared to hear. People always assumed I was lonely because I lived alone. Maybe they were right, but I had my routines to keep me grounded. Mornings started with black coffee and a crossword puzzle, afternoons meant sorting through the cluttered inventory at work, and evenings were for true crime podcasts or a good book. I liked predictability, it made the world feel safe. But that week had been different. The power had gone out unexpectedly the night before, plunging the neighborhood into a suffocating silence. My phone buzzed endlessly with complaints from neighbors on the community app, frustrated posts about flickering lights, appliances turning on and off without warning. I wasn't bothered. Strange things happened in old houses like mine. It was a creaky, two-story relic from the 1920s, with drafty windows and a basement I avoided. Quirks were part of its charm, or so I told myself. But that night, charm gave way to something else. Something that didn't belong. The next morning, sunlight poured through the windows, banishing the memory of the shadow to the back of my mind. It was easier to pretend it hadn't happened in the safety of daylight. I went through my routine, coffee, shower, work. But something felt off. At the shop, customers came and went, but their voices sounded distant. My co-workers asked if I was feeling okay. I lied and said I was fine, but my hands trembled as I sorted through old, dusty books. By the time I returned home, the sun had already dipped below the horizon, leaving the house cloaked in shadows. I hesitated on the front porch, key in hand. For the first time in years, I didn't want to go inside. But I did. The house greeted me with its usual creaks and groans, the familiar scent of old wood and lavender air freshener. I flicked on the lights, half expecting to see it again, but the living room was empty. I laughed at myself, a nervous, hollow sound. "You're losing it, Claire," I muttered. As I settled onto the couch, determined to push the fear aside, the light in the kitchen flickered. Just once. Then again. I glanced over, my heart skipping a beat. The bulb went out. Darkness swallowed the kitchen, but the faint glow from the living room lamp spilled in, enough to illuminate the edges of the counter. Enough to see the shadow. It was there again. This time, it wasn't still. It moved across the kitchen wall, as if pacing. I clenched the blanket draped over me, frozen in place. "Who's there?" My voice cracked. The shadow didn't answer. Instead, it stopped, its head tilting to the side like it was listening. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the coffee table, and ran to the front door. My hands fumbled with the lock, but no matter how much I twisted and pulled, the door wouldn't open. It was jammed. A cold breeze brushed against my neck. I spun around, but there was nothing there. The shadow was gone. Breathing heavily, I backed into the corner of the room, my eyes darting around for any sign of movement. The house was quiet again, eerily so. Too quiet. I needed to leave, but my car keys were upstairs in the bedroom. Mustering every ounce of courage, I darted up the stairs 2 at a time. The hallway stretched out before me, its length swallowed in darkness. The door to my bedroom was ajar, the light inside flickering like a dying candle. I hesitated, gripping the banister tightly. "Just get the keys and go," I whispered to myself. But as I stepped into the room, the door slammed shut behind me. I turned, heart racing, and saw it. The shadow stood in the corner, taller than before, its edges rippling like smoke. It stepped forward, slow and deliberate, and I stumbled back, my back hitting the edge of the bed. "Stay away!" I screamed, my voice cracking. The shadow didn't stop. It loomed closer, and as it did, the room grew impossibly cold. My breath misted in the air, and my vision blurred with tears. I grabbed the bedside lamp and swung it at the shadow, but it passed through without resistance, the light bulb shattering against the wall. The shadow paused, as if amused. And then it did something I will never forget. It reached down. Its hand, dark and wispy, slid across the floor and touched my own shadow. For a moment, I felt a strange tug, like something was pulling at my chest. My knees buckled, and I collapsed onto the bed. The room spun, and as my vision darkened, I saw my shadow rise from the floor, twisting and stretching until it stood beside the entity. It turned its head toward me, its movements mirroring my own. Then everything went black. When I woke up, the world was wrong. I was lying on my bed, but the light streaming through the windows was dim and gray, as if filtered through storm clouds. My clock blinked 12 o'clock repeatedly, the steady rhythm grating against my already frazzled nerves. My body felt heavy, like I was pinned to the mattress by invisible weights. Then I noticed the shadow. It was there on the wall, unmoving, but somehow sharper than before. Its edges weren't blurry like shadows should be, they were clean and defined, almost like it had been etched onto the plaster. I forced myself upright, my limbs sluggish and weak. The room was colder than it should have been for early October, and the air tasted metallic, like pennies. As I swung my legs over the side of the bed, I saw something else that made my stomach churn. My shadow wasn't beneath me. It was standing. Watching. I scrambled back, pressing myself against the headboard. The shadow tilted its head again, that eerie, mocking gesture. And then, as if it could hear my thoughts, it moved to the wall and gestured toward the dresser where my car keys sat. For the first time, I understood. The shadow wanted me gone. It was trying to scare me out of my own house. A surge of defiance rose in me. I wasn't about to let a trick of light, or whatever this thing was, force me to abandon my home. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand, but the screen was black, no matter how many times I pressed the power button. The shadow didn't move, just stood there, waiting. Something clicked in my mind. I remembered the antique mirror I'd brought home from the shop 2 weeks ago. I'd set it against the wall in the attic, intending to catalog it later. It had been unnerving even then, its tarnished surface etched with strange symbols I couldn't quite decipher. Could it be the source of this nightmare? My breath hitched. The mirror. That had to be it. I forced myself to my feet, my legs trembling as I crept past the shadow. It didn't follow me but shifted slightly, as if it were observing, calculating. I stumbled out of the room and up the narrow staircase to the attic. The mirror was still there, covered by a dusty sheet. My hands shook as I yanked the fabric away, revealing its polished surface. My reflection stared back at me, pale and wide-eyed. "Is this what you want?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. The shadow appeared behind me in the reflection, but when I turned, it wasn't there. The attic door slammed shut. I spun around, but there was no wind, no explanation. My pulse thundered as the shadow's presence filled the room, growing larger, darker, more oppressive. The mirror began to hum, a low, resonant sound that vibrated in my chest. My reflection started to change. The figure in the glass moved, but it wasn't me, it was slower, more deliberate. The shadow in the mirror smiled. I stumbled back, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The figure in the mirror raised a hand, and I felt my own arm lift against my will. Panic coursed through me as I realized I wasn't in control anymore. My legs carried me forward, closer to the mirror, no matter how much I fought against it. The reflection leaned forward, pressing its hand against the glass. My own hand mirrored the motion, fingers brushing the cold surface. And then it spoke. Not in words, but in a soundless whisper that slithered into my mind. "You called me here." The weight of its meaning hit me like a punch to the gut. I hadn't summoned anything, not intentionally, but I'd brought the mirror into my house. I'd placed it here, disturbed its resting place. The reflection smirked, its expression twisting into something inhuman. Its eyes darkened, becoming endless voids, and its hand pushed harder against the glass. Cracks spiderwebbed across the mirror's surface, and I felt an unbearable pressure in my chest, as if something inside me was trying to break free. The shadow wasn't just a reflection anymore. It stepped out of the mirror, a tangible, living void. The room's temperature plummeted, frost forming on the edges of the cracked glass. I screamed, scrambling backward, but there was nowhere to go. The shadow loomed over me, its form flickering and shifting. It didn't touch me, but I felt its presence seep into every corner of my mind. Memories surfaced, fears, regrets, secrets I'd buried deep. It was inside me, tearing through the fabric of my soul. The mirror shattered. The sound was deafening, and for a moment, everything went still. I lay on the floor, trembling, my vision blurred with tears. The shadow was gone, or so I thought. As I staggered to my feet, I noticed the faint outline of a figure on the far wall. My shadow was back, but it wasn't moving with me anymore. It moved on its own. It turned, head cocked in that familiar, mocking tilt, and smiled. And then it whispered in my voice, "You're not leaving." I didn't leave the house. Not because I didn't want to, but because I couldn't. Days bled into nights in an unrelenting cycle, but outside the windows, the world looked wrong. The sun never rose completely, the sky hovered in an endless gray dusk, shadows stretching unnaturally long across the floor. My clock stayed frozen at 12 o'clock, its blinking light a mocking reminder that time no longer mattered. I tried to open the doors, smash the windows, scream for help, but nothing worked. Every attempt ended the same way. I'd find myself waking up in the same spot, on the same bed, with the shadow watching me from the wall. It was always there now. Sometimes, it stood still, blending into the corners of the room. Other times, it moved, pacing or crouching like a predator waiting for its prey to exhaust itself. I stopped trying to fight it. One day, as I sat on the living room floor, staring blankly at the wall, the shadow did something different. It reached out, its form stretching unnaturally, and touched the surface of the mirror I'd hung by the staircase years ago. The glass rippled like water, and I saw something that froze the blood in my veins. It wasn't my reflection anymore. The figure in the mirror looked like me, but its face was twisted, wrong. Its eyes were black voids, and its mouth curled into a sinister smile. Behind it was not my living room but a bleak, empty expanse of gray mist and distant, screaming figures. I stumbled backward, shaking my head. "This isn't real," I whispered. "This can't be real." The shadow tilted its head, mocking me. It stepped closer, and as it did, the figure in the mirror moved with it, perfectly synchronized. That's when I noticed the horrifying detail I'd overlooked. My own reflection wasn't in the mirror anymore. I turned to look at the window, desperate to see something, anything, that would ground me in reality. But the glass reflected nothing. Not me, not the room, just the endless gray expanse I'd seen in the mirror. "You're not real," I shouted, my voice cracking. "This is a nightmare. I'll wake up." The shadow laughed, a soundless, guttural vibration that rattled my very bones. And then it spoke, not in whispers this time, but in my voice, distorted and echoing. "Wake up," it mocked. "You already did." The words sent a jolt of terror through me. My mind raced, grasping at the pieces of a puzzle that didn't make sense. "What do you mean?" I demanded, my voice shaking. The shadow stepped closer, looming over me now, its form blending with the walls and ceiling until it was everywhere at once. The gray mist in the mirror began to seep out, curling around my feet, cold and damp like fog rolling in from the sea. The voice came again, softer now, almost gentle. "You don't belong here. You never did." And then I remembered. Not all at once, but in fragments, like shards of broken glass piecing themselves together. The mirror. The night I'd brought it home from the shop. I'd been so careful, wrapping it in cloth to keep it from scratching. But as I'd carried it upstairs, I'd slipped. The staircase. The impact. The sickening crack of my skull against the edge of the steps. The realization hit me like a freight train. I wasn't alive. I hadn't been since that night. The shadow wasn't haunting me. It was part of me. "You called me," it repeated, its voice echoing in my mind. "When you broke the barrier. When you let me in." The mirror hadn't been cursed or haunted, it had been a doorway. And in my final moments, as my life slipped away, I had crossed through it, into this place. This wasn't my house. It wasn't even the real world. It was a prison, a liminal space where I was trapped with the worst parts of myself. The shadow stepped closer, its form merging with mine until I could feel it seeping into my skin. The air grew heavier, colder, until I could barely breathe. "You're me," I whispered. The shadow's smile widened. "And you're mine." The world tilted, the gray mist swallowing everything. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My body felt like it was dissolving, piece by piece, as the shadow pulled me deeper into itself. And then, just before the darkness consumed me entirely, I saw it, the mirror, cracked and splintered, reflecting not my face, but the shadows. I don't know how long it's been. Time doesn't exist here. I've stopped fighting. I've stopped screaming. The shadow is all that's left of me now, watching, waiting. It stands in the corner, just like before, but now it doesn't have to mimic anyone else. Because I'm the reflection now. I see you. Standing there. Reading this. Watching me. And I'm watching you back.